thank you for having me here today. So as Jen said, my name is Lydia Leith. I am a co-organizer of a local nonpartisan civic engagement group called French Creek Indivisible. We recently organized the Racism Has No Home Here march that happened in Edinburgh at the end of August. We have also organized the memorial to Ruth Bader Ginsburg that was out in front of the Borough building, as well as just organizing monthly meetings and having other actions based out of Erie. I also work at the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants as their Trauma and Addiction Program Coordinator. And prior to that, I was working as a trauma therapist with children and adolescents in some of the Crawford County schools with kids who had experienced trauma, as well as men convicted of sexual offenses after they were released from jail or prison. So I've worked with a lot of different diverse populations and a lot of different people. When Jen asked me to come in and talk about kind of racism or racial justice and the healing that needs to happen in that respect, I tend to bring my lens of trauma-informed work to every issue that I encounter. And that's what I've done here with racism and talking about racial inequality in our country. So I guess if it's all right with everyone else, and feel free to interrupt me, this isn't some formal thing, that I would love for this to be conversational. So if you have questions or if something doesn't make sense, please feel free to ask. But what I'll do is I'll talk a little bit about trauma, make sure we all are on the same page with kind of our understanding of trauma, and do the same with racism as a concept to make sure we're all on the same page with what racism means and how I'm defining it. And then talk about the intersection of racism as a form of trauma and what does that mean when we're trying to heal the trauma of racism and what does healing look like in that context. So if everyone is on board with that, then I'll just get started. Okay. So to understand trauma, I think we have to understand not only what it is, but then what impact it can have on people. So trauma is any stressful, distressing, disturbing event that causes distress for someone long after the event itself has stopped. And so a trauma can be a one-time event. Having a natural disaster destroy your home is a traumatic event. It happens once and it's over, but it causes a lot of distress and probably causes distress after the fact. But trauma can also be something that happens many times over a long period of time. So chronic stress, right? Incidents of abuse in like a childhood abuse or, incidents of racism, right? Something that's happening a lot. It might not be a giant event, but it happens a lot and creates chronic stress for the person. And so when we're looking, that's what trauma is, but the impact of trauma and where our understanding of trauma over time and within the last decade or so has expanded to understand that trauma doesn't just affect the person in the moment. Prior to me doing the work that I do in trauma, people really believed that you could experience a trauma and bounce back from it pretty easily, especially if you were a child. That people used to say, oh, kids are resilient, they just bounce back, they'll forget it. If the child was a baby, they won't remember that bad thing happened. But what research showed over time and within the last decade, research has really developed to support the understanding that a traumatic event, even if a child cannot explicitly remember what happened, they carry the symptoms of that traumatic experience with them long into adulthood if it's not addressed. And so what we're seeing is that trauma has a very real, tangible impact on a person's psychology, biology, and social well-being. And so I like to think of it as like a pyramid, and that's how a lot of trauma therapists will think about it, is as a pyramid. And that if as a child you experience trauma, that kind of destabilizes your foundation of the pyramid, right? And then every layer after that becomes slightly skewed or slightly distorted. So we know that trauma impacts the brain, that when you experience something scary, right, your heart races, you go into that like fight, flight, or freeze response. And what happens on a biological level is that the front part of your brain, the smart part of your brain that's doing math problems, that's learning, that's critically thinking about things, that's shut off. Because if a car is barreling towards me, I don't need to know, oh, if I calculate the trajectory of this car, right? I just need to know I need to jump out of the way or I need to, step aside, right? So that's the back part of your brain, that survival part, and that's engaged. And so your brain is a muscle that the more you work a certain part of your brain, the stronger it becomes and the more dominant it becomes. So like I was saying with trauma, if you experience chronic trauma, if this part of your brain is always getting shut down and this part of your brain is always getting used, then this part of your brain, the survival part, the part that's not very smart in reality, right? It's very simple black and white thinking. This part becomes the dominant side of your brain. And so then in situations like in a math class where maybe this part of your brain should be being used and should be working, what's happening is this part of your brain is too weak to function. It's too weak to overpower the more dominant survival part of your brain. So then you can never settle down. So you'll see kids in class fidgeting or looking all around, distractible, and teachers will say that they're not paying attention, but really what's happening is that that survival part of their brain is just engaged all the time. They don't know if, you know, something scary is going to happen. They don't know, hypothetically, if dad was abusive at home, they don't know if dad's going to bust in through the door at school, even though logically, if the front part of their brain was more strengthened, right, they could logically say that's not going to happen. Dad's not going to just show up out of nowhere. But because that part of their brain is so weak and this part is so strong, they just always know I need to be on edge. And what that creates for people is if you're always on edge, if you're always assuming something bad or scary is going to happen, then it's really hard to develop good social relationships, right? It's really hard if I assume everyone that does something, let's say we have a fire drill in school and we all have to line up, you know, to do the fire drill, and someone bumps me, right? And a non-traumatized person, if someone bumps me, I'd go, oh, it's okay. You know, I know it, they didn't mean it. They weren't trying to be mean or rude. But a traumatized person might have that experience and get mad because they think, oh, this person wants to fight me. This person's trying to hurt me, right? Because that's what their survival brain is thinking. Someone's always trying to hurt me. I got to fight my way out of this. And so they might fight people all the time in situations where no one was, you know, instigating a fight. And that would make it really hard to develop friendships, right? No one wants to be friends with the person that's always picking a fight with people for seemingly no good reason. And so if we're thinking about, right, the triangle, so you have the trauma, you have the biological impact on your brain, which then affects your ability to problem solve, it affects your ability to build relationships. So then you develop unhealthy coping mechanisms. So then instead of being able to rationalize or to think through and problem solve, your solutions are going to be, maybe I drink, or maybe I use drugs, or maybe I use sexual, you know, relationships as a way to cope with my lack of social intimacy with people. Or maybe I do high risk behaviors and I drive too fast, or I don't think through the consequences of my actions of what I'm doing. And so all these high risk behaviors then also have very real health complications too, right? If I'm using drugs, then I'm exposing myself to potentially more diseases, or you know, if I'm having lots of unprotected sex with strangers, then I'm exposing myself to more STDs and the health complications with that, or smoking and the impact that smoking can have on your lungs and your body. And so that creates very real physical health complications as well. And the tip of that pyramid at the end of the day, and research has shown this, that people with 6 or more traumatic childhood experiences die 20 years earlier than their non-traumatized peers. So trauma, when left untreated, can take 20 years of someone's life away. In addition, you know, because of all these things that kind of build up over time. So this really is like life or death, dealing with trauma and making sure that we as a community are healing trauma. But that sometimes trauma is in the eye of the beholder. What might seem traumatic to me may not seem as traumatic to other people, just given life experiences, right? That something might be triggering me because of what I've experienced that might seem like no big deal to someone else. And so it's really important that when we talk about trauma, we understand that it's not like a one size fits all, that people can experience a lot of different things and have a lot of different reactions to those experiences. So that's trauma. Now to think about racism. The way I think about racism is it's prejudice, it's discrimination based on a racial identity, but it is always systemic or has a systemic nature to it. So I just want to clarify, Prejudice is like having a biased attitude or belief towards someone or something, right? And discrimination is putting that prejudice into action, right? It's doing something, an action or a policy based on that prejudice that targets a group of people or a certain person. But racism is like both of those things because of a racial identity, but it's always systemic, and I'll explain why. So prejudice and discrimination. Yes, go ahead.
Explain systemic.
So systemic means it's supported by broader systems in our country or in our communities. So it's not just me saying something negative to one person, that's individual. Systemic would be, I'm saying this, but it's also supported by policies in place. It's also supported by policies in the school system. It's also supported by governmental laws and regulations. It's also supported by policing practices and policies. And I'll get more into that a little bit later.
I recently heard the word intrinsic biases.
Mm.
And I love that because we all have biases. We were raised, we were human.
Right.
And we have the biases of our parents when we graduate high school, plus, and then there's extrinsic biases, which would be the ones you just described, the systemic parts.
Yeah.
But the intrinsic are the ones that we learned growing up, around the kitchen table, sitting in front of the TV, whatever,
Right.
in that household.
Right. Yeah, that's a great.
The words,
That's a great example of how there are individualized, like you were saying, intrinsic biases that we just have on an individual level. We all have it, and it can be totally unrelated to.
And hers are different than mine.
Exactly. They can be very personal. I had one bad experience with a farmer, and now I'm biased towards farmers. Right? It can be totally separate from anything societal. But yes, you're right. Then these extrinsic biases, these systemic biases, are bigger, and they have an impact on entire communities or entire groups of people. And so I think, and this is a great segue into this, but that racism, when I'm talking about racism is the intersection of both these individual biases that people have that are also supported by systems that perpetuate the same biases, and that a racial slur said by an individual doesn't just have the weight of the individual, it has the weight of the entire system and the history of a country that has treated people differently because of their racial identity. And that's a really unique quality to racism specifically, and specifically within the United States, that this concept of race as we know it didn't really exist until the United States was born. Because prior to that, there were still biases, there was still prejudice, there was still discrimination, right? But if we look back in history, a lot of those discrimination, or a lot of the war that was started, it was based on country of origin, or it was based on a religion that you ascribed to, right? That they were based in other factors, but race as an idea of this, like based on the color of your skin, that didn't happen until the United States, when European wealthy plantation owners experienced a revolt of the poor working class, poor European servants and the poor African slaves, that they banded together in like I'm trying to think, 1670s. Yeah, 1670s. They started to work together, and they said, this is an unjust system. We're going to buck the system. We're going to get rid of racist inequality where these wealthy people can take advantage of the poor people. And what the wealthy people did is they said, oh, no. European servants, you're like us, we're white. You're not like these slaves, because those slaves are black. And suddenly now these wealthy elite had a term and had an identity that they could say, like, oh, we're more alike. Even though you're poor and I'm rich, we're more alike because we're white. Doesn't matter what country we came from. Doesn't matter that you're German and I'm Italian or what, right? That, well, now we're all white. And those people are black. They're not like us. And so they were able to like divide and conquer the working class people that really threatened to overthrow the system. And so when I say that racism is inherently systemic, what I'm saying is that race as a concept was created as a tool to reinforce classist systems. And so racism as an idea is inherently systemic because it was used to kind of enforce these systems. Does that make sense?
Mhm. I keep thinking more on a global scale, like South Africa
Sure, right.
and Europe. Because it's just race, the whole thing is just as bad there.
Mhm.
Now, what you just described says it's all the United States fault.
It's very unique to the United States. The concept did not exist until the kind of slavery that we instituted in the United States started. Chattel slavery did not exist in the form that we had it in the United States in other places. They had slavery, but it wasn't something that you could be born into and reborn into and kept into for your entire life. That's not how slavery worked until the United States created it. It was something that you could either work your way out of, or if you had a child, they were not inherently born into slavery. That was a concept that was new to the United States version of slavery.
But when I'm talking about racism, I don't just put it down as slavery. I put it down as discrimination because of color.
Right.
And there it is, global.
Sure, right. And you're talking about right now racism today. I'm saying that racism couldn't exist without the concept of race, and the birth of race as a concept, as a thing that we even defined people by, was not brought up until the time of slavery. So now we see it has spread everywhere. Racism exists in lots of different places. But the point here being that racism as a concept is systemic. It envelops lots of different systems. It's more than just one person saying one thing, right? That it's everywhere. And like we were saying, right, experiencing a racial slur or an individualized form of racism is not just an individual assault or an individual bias. It holds the weight of the entire system. And so in terms of trauma, right, if we're looking at, there's within the trauma treatment community, there's something called generational trauma or historical trauma. And this is the idea that we can carry the traumatic symptoms that we never actually experienced from like the trauma itself, that might have been experienced by our parents or our grandparents or our great-grandparents, but we still will manifest the symptoms. So an example that people use a lot is like survivors of the Great Depression. People that survived the Great Depression tended to maybe hoard a lot of items or food because they didn't know when they were going to get their next food or you know what they might need, right? Because there was such scarcity. If someone was born into that household where they were hoarding lots of things, then the child grows up thinking, well, that's what you do. You just never throw anything away. You save everything. You hoard it all, right? Hoarding is a very typical reaction to trauma, because if everything else feels unstable, then I can stabilize this by making sure I can always have what I need. And so this child born into this might not have experienced the Great Depression, but they are now hoarding things just like their parent was.
I
And
have a hard time, I really have a hard time with the word hoarding.
okay,
My grandmother, my dad was born during the Depression. They didn't have money. My grandpa sold coal in the winter and ice in the summer, and usually people don't pay because they can't.
Mhm.
But it wasn't hoarding, but grandma would pull the string off the potato sack and wrap it around the ball.
Mhm.
And it was in the buffet in the kitchen. Now, I know she never had to buy a string. But she wasn't, the word hoarding, I guess, bothers me.
okay, yeah. So no, just hanging on to things, right? Saving things, saving lots of stuff.
Repurposing.
Sure, yeah, being very like utilitarian or resourceful. And we'll see people doing that to the extreme, right? Because when something is scary or traumatic, right, we have extreme reactions that maybe don't make sense, right? So maybe I'm saving every scrap of paper. I'm saving every receipt because I don't know if I'll run out of paper. That we could all maybe logically say, there's plenty of paper. We can get you more paper. You don't need to save receipt paper in order to write on it. But people would do that. And then you'd see their children or even their grandchildren doing similar things that you can say, logically, you don't need to hang on to that, you know, one little thing, or you don't need to do that anymore. It doesn't make sense in this context, but it absolutely made sense during the Great Depression when that trauma was first experienced. And so that's the idea of generational or historical trauma. And so in thinking about racism, right, there's a lot of historical trauma and generational trauma as a result of racism, right? If we're talking about slavery, right? Imagine if you knew that somewhere in your history, people were brought here without their consent, that they were forced to be here, that they experienced, I mean, slavery in and of itself, right, involves some form of physical assault or even like sexual abuse or rape or things like that, right? Like all these really horrific experiences of trauma that some of these people experienced that could have been passed down through historical or generational trauma. Or we look at lynching in like the 1860s and 1870s, that white mobs of people would go and allege that some person of color, some Black man committed some offense, and without any due process, without any judicial ruling, this mob of white people would murder an innocent Black man. And that happened all the time. It happened all the time in the South. It even happened in Pennsylvania. I mean, it's happened throughout our country that these lynch mobs exist. And so if that's in your community's history, right, then there's potential for historical or generational trauma through that experience. There's also less graphic or less violent forms of historical or generational trauma that we could look at as well. An example would be redlining. I'm not sure if everyone's familiar with that, but the concept of in 1950s or 60s, banks had a practice of drawing redlining around the poor communities of color, particularly Black neighborhoods. And they'd draw a red line around it and they'd say, if anyone lives in this zip code or in this area, we're not going to give them a home loan. So while maybe a white neighbor, a block or two over, could go and say, hey, I'd like a home loan. I'd like to be able to buy my house that I'm living in. A Black neighbor 2 blocks over would be denied a home loan. And maybe they had the same exact record. Maybe they were equal by all accounts. But because one lived in the Black neighborhood and one lived in the white neighborhood, the white families were given home loans. And we all know that if you have the ability to buy your own home, then that creates just a different level of financial stability, a different level of financial support that then that parent could give to their child, right? If I own my home, I can give it away, or I could sell it and give that money to my family. But it gives you more equity in a way that if you don't have the ability, if you're always just paying rent and you're never able to own your own home, or you're reliant on a landlord to fix problems as opposed to having the resources to own your own home and take care of your own home. That creates, right, generational, I would say, like financial trauma, or even like the chronic stress of not, having the supports or resources you need because you're just always paying into the rent as opposed to being able to kind of invest in yourself through a home loan. Does that make sense?
There's a good movie that talks about racism, Great Invaders. Have you ever heard of that movie?
Yeah.
It's an excellent movie about racism.
Awesome.
People that are Blacks kind of excel lyrically out of it. So,
Yeah, that's great. Another example that I think people don't really think about is legacy admissions into college. So on the face value of it, legacy admissions are just colleges might have a certain quota of admissions that they'll give to legacy applicants, right? That's if your parent, grandparent, great-grandparent, or a family member attended that university, you might get a special privilege to try to get into that university as well. But if we know anything about the history of the United States, we know that institutions of learning were not always equally accessible to people of different racial backgrounds, right? That it wasn't until 1954 that segregation was illegal. So prior to that, it was perfectly legal to not allow a person of color to attend a college or university. And an example that I pulled in preparing for this, so if we know that Harvard was founded in 1636, one of the earliest colleges in the United States, 1636 to 1954 is about 318 years worth of students and alumni that Black people or people of color would never have a right to attend that university for 318 years.
I think women is close to that too.
Probably, yeah. And so if we're thinking about the disparity in that, right, even as a white person, I have at least 318 more years of a chance to have a family member tie to that college in order to attend as a legacy admission, right? So legacy admissions inherently have a slight bias towards white people because white people had 318 years that they could access that college that people of color could not. And so again, we're thinking about what kind of educational access or what kind of traumas could occur when you can't access a certain level of education, when you're blocked from, moving past a certain intellectual point or educational point, when you don't have access to those networks or to those people or institutions. So that's one way of thinking about the intersection of racism and trauma. The other way that I want to just bring up for people to reflect on, and I know it's not going to be a perfect analogy, but one that I think is helpful to put it into a different context is the idea of an emotionally abusive relationship or domestic violence, because I think that is becoming a lot more talked about as a topic, that people as service providers are dealing with domestic violence or dealing with abusive relationships, and we can maybe relate to that easier than we can to incidents of racism, but that in many ways, Black Americans or people of color in the United States are in an emotionally abusive relationship with white America, with the US systems at large, or with this idea of like the white dominant point of view. And what I mean is that emotionally abusive in the way that, as we talked about, right, that white people historically, or US systems historically and currently, have physically, mentally, and emotionally harmed Black Americans or people of color. Whether we're talking about slavery in historical terms or modern terms with police brutality or mass incarceration or individual prejudices, that there are very real examples of harm that are happening to people. And yet, as we see with emotionally abusive relationships, right, that in an emotionally abusive relationship, someone is hurt and the other person says, no, that wasn't, you're not that hurt, right? That's called gaslighting. That if someone is harmed by their partner and their partner says, oh, you're overreacting, or I didn't say that, I didn't do that, right? That it's called gaslighting the person, because you're trying to convince them that their thoughts, feelings, experiences, or identity are not important, right? That are not valid or not accurate, that somehow their experience of the world is not true. And if that occurs often enough, some people can really be convinced that their experience was not true, that, okay, maybe I was wrong, or maybe I was overreacting, even though you were justified in those reactions. And in many ways, the United States, and particularly white people in positions of power, oftentimes gaslight Black Americans about their own experiences of racism. And if we're thinking about gaslighting, particularly with the piece about denying the validity of someone's identity, right? How often have we heard someone say, well, I don't see color, right? It's meant as a nice thing, right? I don't see color. People are trying to say, like, I don't treat someone differently because of the color of their skin. But if I say I don't see color, then I'm denying that person that their identity as a person of color, as a Black person, or as a however they identify, I'm denying their identity as that racial identity. And for them, that might be important. It might be important culturally. It might be important emotionally. Or I also, by saying I don't see color, that this identity doesn't matter, then I am also saying that your thoughts, feelings, and experiences as a person of color don't really matter either, right? That if I say I don't see color, I'm taking just a little bit of power away from that identity that some people might really be using to hurt you, right? That someone that is more actively racist or actively discriminatory might be using. And so that's one way that sometimes we can maybe unintentionally gaslight someone into believing that maybe their identity is not valid, or maybe their experience was wrong, or maybe they're overreacting. The same could be true about when people say all lives matter in response to Black Lives Matter. So Black Lives Matter at its core is just the idea that a Black person's human life has value, and they have a right to their own life, that no one has a right to kill Black people without justice. And when someone says all lives matter, right? The analogy that I've heard used that I think is perfect for this is when we talk about like a tragic funeral, maybe for like a small child, right? If I had a child that passed away and I'm having a funeral for them, and someone came in and I'm saying, oh, my child that was such a good person, and she shouldn't have had to die, or whatever I was saying. And if someone came in and said, yeah, but all children matter. All children matter. Well, it's true. All children matter. All lives matter. All people matter, right? Everyone has an inherent human dignity and worth that we should honor. The choice of timing for these conversations and these words, right, can be really harmful and can be used to undermine and to gaslight, like we were talking about, right? Can be used to gaslight a person to say, okay, well, maybe I am wrong in saying Black Lives Matter. Maybe I shouldn't be saying that, or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this isn't right. When in reality, there's a huge portion of our community that are mourning really profound losses, and they deserve the space to be able to mourn those losses. Does that make sense? Okay. So to kind of end this all, to cap this off, in thinking about healing racist trauma, I kind of came up with 3 different concepts for healing. And I don't have all the answers, but with my background in trauma, I know one thing about trauma, and there's a book titled The Body Keeps the Score. And it's this idea that your body, even if you're not actively aware of it, your body hangs on to the trauma that you experience. But at the same time, your body also hangs on to the knowledge of what it needs to heal. And that a lot of trauma treatment, while there's lots of different ways to treat trauma, a lot of the common themes are all centered around this idea that if I give my client the space, the stability, and the safety to process their trauma with me, that they'll come to the right conclusions for what they need to heal. They'll be able to sort it out in their own head about what thoughts or feelings they need to process in order to heal. And that some forms of therapy involve very little input from the therapist. A lot of it is just creating the space for a person to process their trauma. And I think we see that in a lot of different disciplines, whether it's you're in a more scientific background and you're talking about a person's instinct, or if you're in a therapeutic background and you're talking about conscience or psychological healing, or the body keeps the score, or if you're in a religious, spiritual space and you're talking about divinity or the spirit or whatever we're tapping into, that's a universal truth that's bigger than ourselves. Whatever angle you're coming at it from, that there is this understanding that humans, we have all that we need to know. We're tapped into something bigger than ourselves that tells us what we need, right? Like just when I know that I'm thirsty and I need to drink water, our bodies know and our minds know and our hearts and souls know what we need to heal. But it's about creating that safe space for people to process and to process their trauma, to figure out what they need to heal. And whether that's on an individual level or creating space for communities to process the trauma that they need and figure out what they need to heal. So that's one piece, right? That we have the answer inside of us. It's just about creating that space. The second piece is just about systemic reform, right? Systemic redress of modern and historical trauma. That we can't say, well, clearly these systems, whether it's the police system or the criminal justice system or the education system, if we know that these systems have big policy level issues, we can't say, oh, okay, well, we'll just be better. Like, I'll just be better in this system. If we know the problem is systemic, it has to be more than just individuals saying, oh, I'll just be better, right? It has to be a systemic level, it has to be policy change to help address that trauma. And then I think too that there's something to be said about healing the perpetrator of racism, right? Whatever that looks like, whether we're talking about an individual or a systemic level perpetrator. But that having worked with men convicted of sexual offenses, I truly believe to my core that people can change. There are some people that aren't going to change, but there are a lot of people that are very capable of change and of improving their own mindset and processing their own trauma in order to not perpetuate that cycle of violence or to continue, you know, that concept of hurt people, right? That when some people are hurting, they lash out and hurt others. And so I think that there's something to be said about finding ways to heal the perpetrators of this trauma, and how do we engage them and not say, oh, well, because you're racist, I can't talk to you, or because you said that one racist thing, like we can no longer be friends. But how do we call people in instead of calling them out? How do we bring them in and maybe offer them space to process their trauma and space to feel safe, to help them unpack those beliefs that are problematic. And involved with healing the perpetrator is increasing their contact with diversity. Research has shown that it is a lot harder for you to hold a discriminatory or prejudicial belief if you have contact with a person from that background or multiple people from that background, right? Because all of a sudden those stereotypes don't make sense because you have evidence right in front of you that that's not true. And that's what the research has shown. And so, you know, bringing people together and creating spaces for people to interact with others that aren't from their same racial background or gender identity background or sexual orientation background or socioeconomic background, you know, that when we can interact with people that aren't like us, we all become better people, right? And like you said, like we all have biases of some kind. We all have biases. And so the more we can do to bring people from all different walks of life together, the better we will all become as a community. And that's kind of it. That's all I've got for now. But thank you all so much for listening. And if you want to have a deeper discussion about this or ask more questions, I'd be glad to participate.
And I would just like to, when you're talking about it, I wish that you would include not only the Blacks, but the Indians and the
Hispanics.
and
Sure.
Hispanics, and because so many colors and so many people.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. No, you're absolutely right. And I should have maybe said that more explicitly, that I understand that this can be applied to many different people. This was just one. I only had 30, 40 minutes to dive into this, right? But we could do that, right? We could do that with every group of people and say, look at this historical trauma and how can we fix this?
When I'm listening to it, I see the Indians.
Yeah,
I see,
absolutely.
you know, so it's.
Yeah, it's so much bigger. You're right. Absolutely.
But I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
And I think on the end of, as we near the end of this election cycle, your final point on how do we build the diversity to have the conversations between people who are not like me is going to become ever more important.
Yeah, absolutely. That's probably the hardest one. I feel like it's easy to help someone that we see that's hurt. It's harder when we see someone that's been hurting someone else and to see that the perpetrator as another person needing help. Yeah. Well, thank you.